Hi everyone, Michael here from Plan It All, and up next on our docket for this video series on how to set up your grow, we're going to be focusing on buckets. Possibly not the most interesting subject in the world, but definitely one worth dedicating a sole video to because there are just so many different possibilities out there. There's stuff you just grab at your hardware store. There's things that are built specifically for growers that are using one method versus another. So I'm going to show you my method. This is not the quintessential end-all, only do it this way kind of solution. This is just one that has worked exceptionally well for me. All right, we've got a few steps to get through here, so let's switch over. I'm going to go into the shop and we're going to start out with how we make the lids the way we need them.
All right, so this is my preferred way of making holes in my lids for my water baskets. So I'm using relatively large water baskets. There's arguments pro and con to this. It's an opinion. I like the extra stability these give me, and since I found these great buckets at Lowe's, made by Craftsman, they fit in there quite nicely. And you know, there's holes already in this particular basket up here, so if I need to, I can bind them down to the lids. But the important thing here is, how do I make a hole for this into this, but not compromise the strength of the lid so it can handle, you know, that downward force of a growing plant in there. You really don't want to, you know, injure your plastic lid enough that it might crack and push through. So the way I've found that works best for me is melting my way through. When you melt through plastic, and this is just, think of this as like a cookie cutter for 1/4 of this shape. The plastic edge, even though it does become a little brittle from the heating, it is less likely to have a crack in part of that perimeter going around the shape that then could travel into it. So not for everybody. Cutting is still perfectly fine. This is just kind of my preference. Now, this little tool here, I made it a while ago, and it is designed to fit to the inside diameter of the lid. So when you make your hole, you can't just trace this onto your lid and cut it out because this is going to fall in. You need to observe that little lip there. What I did here, hopefully you can see it on camera, is this is roughly the curvature. It's pretty darn close. It's not perfect. And then the straight part here ends before you get to the curvature of the next corner. So what you can do is melt this, then go around, melt this side, then go around and melt this side. And you see each time I rotate the basket, that's gonna be going in there. It fits perfectly to each of those sides. So then once you measure out where you wanna start, you melt, melt, melt. You get the idea here. So I'm gonna go ahead and mark these out, and then we're gonna, I've got a torch sitting off here. We're gonna warm this up and melt it through. Okay, and we're back. Okay, each of my lids here for my 4 buckets have been marked out. I've got, this is pretty close to that inside edge here. So not the lip, but the inside edge of the basket. I'm going to melt either on the line, or actually I'm gonna really try and go just inside the line. You can always make your hole bigger. It's a lot harder to make it smaller if you've overshot. So I'm going to do these one at a time. I'm going to just kind of march my way around it. I will have to do a lot of reheating of my, you know, little melty cutter I made here. Couple big things. One, you're melting plastic, so wear gloves. If you don't really have to worry about, if you're careful, you don't need to worry about the heat of the torch. But we got plastic we're going to be melting. It's going to get all drippy. If that drips on your skin, you're going to get a bad burn, not necessarily because of the temperature, but because of how long the heat stays there. So wear gloves. I've got a pair of welding gloves here, work great for this. Any kind of protection is going to be better than nothing. Just make sure that it's a natural product, so like rawhide, split suede, something that's designed to take heat, because a lot of plastics are in the manufacture of our work gloves nowadays, which is great. It makes them durable, but it also can make them melt, and that's what we're trying to avoid. Long sleeves, same reason here. This is a welding jacket I'm wearing, but that's not necessary. You just want to eliminate the risk of dripping hot plastic on yourself. and then take your time and have lots and lots of ventilation. I'm inside a welding shop right now, so I've got a big hood that's going to get turned on. I don't have to worry about fumes. If you're at home, do it outside. Or if you do have the advantage of a big fume hood, have it on. Fresh air ain't gonna hurt you, but the fumes off of this might. All right, let's get to melting. Okay, hopefully you can hear me over the noise of the vent and the torch going on over here. I'm going to heat this up, melt 1/4 of it, warm it up again, and just work my way around. Always better to go slower than faster. All right. So there's our first one. And there we go. One inner, one outer. Now I got 3 more to go. All right, here we are, last one, and you can see, let me see if I can get this in focus here for you. That is a pretty solid edge. Nice and clean, and then the real test, look at that. Fits like a glove, and this one's particularly ideal because look on the bottom here. So much of the edge of the lid comes right up to the edge of the basket. Now, if there was more clearance in there, it wouldn't be a problem because you still have a pretty solid amount of lip sitting over there. So as you do this on your own, just make sure you're taking that into account so you don't melt your way through, have a nice edge, but your basket goes straight through. All right, let's keep going on with this build.
Okay, we're back at the grow tent. Next order of business, we are going to start setting up our buckets. You can use any bucket you like. Like I showed earlier, I'm using these nice square Craftsman ones I picked up at Lowe's. The square is nice because it makes it easier to attach our bulkheads, and we'll get into that in 1 second. The reason we're at the tent right now is we need to take some measurements to figure out exactly how this is all going to fit together. So I'm just going to take a moment. I'm going to put the 4 buckets in that are going to be making up the recirculating deep water culture system and measure their gaps in between. And I've got a little overhead camera here. Hopefully it'll show better than I can get with this camera here, and then we'll move over to the bench and I'll show you how and where to cut your holes. Okay, we're going to try this again. My camera I installed did not record any audio, and I just want you to be able to see the measuring and setup in here. So it's a little bit of a cheat because I already drilled those holes in there. But when it comes to determining your spacing, so if you take a look at my tent here, I do keep the buckets pretty evenly oriented. That's not critical, it just makes it easier because connections are going to be the same. The one connection I'm not too worried about yet is this one. So this is where bucket number 1 is going to have its hose coming out, around, and then through the wall. And then bucket number 4 here also will be doing the same thing. And we're going to have to make a little linkage. It's going to hop over the height of that port there. But first off, determining the distance here, you'll notice the buckets are slightly trapezoidal. You know, they're, if we go bucket edge to bucket edge, we got 4.5 inches here, And then down at the bottom, we're really talking about 6 inches. And that 6 inches is the one that's really important for us, because, well, normally I'd be saying that's where our holes will be, that's where our hole is. And we need to account for the distance plus the thickness of those thread fittings that get glued onto the PVC, as well as the little bit of thickness that sticks out from the bulkhead as it's attached here. So 6 inches down there in my scenario is going to mean I need 4-inch long pieces of PVC that will be going here between buckets 4 and 3, 3 and 2, and then 2 and 1. These other linkages here, we're going to figure out in place as we're assembling it. All right, so here we are back at my workbench. And what the first step really is to drill holes and then make between these threaded pieces, the bulkheads, and some PVC, the linkage that's going to go from the 4 different buckets. We're going to place those first, and then once everything's in place, we're going to figure out the linkage from the buckets that'll actually contain plants back to the reservoir where the Growee is going to interface with the water, monitor and update things, as well as the pump that circulates out the water and freshens up the buckets themselves. So first order of business, we just took those measurements. How much PVC do we need? This can be a little bit tricky, but if you're patient with yourself and are good about dry fitting things, you won't have any problem with it whatsoever. First thing, these are the fittings, and these are bulkheads. Bulkheads are a usually 3-part system. What you have is the exterior fitting, a gasket, and then the nut. And we want to cut the hole for this as low as we can in the bucket so that the nut just barely clears the bottom. And so we're recirculating the water from the bottom there. It helps refresh sediment, things like that. Also, ideally, we want them as centered as possible. And then last but not least, the length. Now, if you've never worked with PVC before, the thread fitting we're going to be using, so this will connect our pipe into our bulkhead there. We have to account not only for the distance we need to span from one bucket to the next, but the fact that there are some dimensional additions here. So the PVC will thread all the way, or sorry, not thread, it'll glue all the way in up to this nut here. And that nut form there is what's going to be up against the bulkhead, and then the bulkhead is its own thickness as well, even once this is threaded all the way down. So we need to add all those dimensions together, plus what we have in the tent from the distance we want to keep from bucket to bucket. What I've figured out is I need my 1.5 inch PVC to be about 4 inches long, and then that'll connect into these, which will thread into these, which will connect into our buckets, and then we'll have a nice manageable set of 4 buckets. All right, let's get going on that. Now for cutting PVC, there's a lot of different modes. Hand saws work great. Plastic really does cut incredibly easily. When you're doing a bunch of things, I like these. This is a little ratcheting cutter that Husky makes. You can get these at Lowe's, Home Depot, any hardware store really is going to have something like this. Make sure you get it with the correct throat size though. This is for up to 2-inch PVC. It is very, very common to get ones that only go up to 1 1/4, which would not work very well if you're using 1.5 inch. So just make sure your tool fits. I'll provide links to each of these things down at the bottom of the video. Okay, so here's our first piece, and it's worth pointing out why I like using these cutters. You don't get burrs. Everything's nice and smooth here. A burr is when like you're cutting with a saw and you get those little scrabbly bits around the edge. Those can interfere with your glue up, and then you might not get a good seal in here. So very worthwhile, I think. But if you got a saw and that's what you're working with, just make sure you go back with some sandpaper and just clean off those edges. Make this nice and smooth. Then you know you're going to get a good bond with your fittings. All right, that's piece one. I need 2 more. All right, there we go. We've got 3 pieces. Now we need 6 thread fittings. Easy enough. Now, when it comes to gluing up PVC, you need to be a little bit careful. We are going to be using PVC cement. There's a bunch of different brands out there. I particularly like Christie's. It's what I've always used, but it does work really, really well. It is messy, as you can see from the top here, so lay down paper and get some gloves. Okay, we're ready to start working. The glue comes in a 2-part system. We have purple primer and blue glue. Primer goes on first. What preps and cleans the surface, makes it a little softer and receptive for the glue, and the glue gets coated on and our pieces seated together. Now, if you've never dealt with PVC before, you're going to be coating the interior and the exterior surface of each joint. And then when you go and push them together, you need to give them a twist, a little quarter turn to make sure they seat really well. And we have glue with no little gaps in there that could cause leaks. And then we're going to need to hold it together. A lot of times I just can't put it on a table and push it down if that's an option. That helps make sure that it doesn't push against you. If you were to just put this together with the primer and glue on there and set it down, there is a decent chance this would actually rise off and fall apart, or at the very least, it wouldn't seat as far as you need it to make a good bond. All right, last thing to mention here, these smell awful. Good ventilation is key, and you don't always have them in the correct orientation. So, with the package orientation here, because it says purple primer, blue glue. That's glue. Primer's over here. Just double check. You don't want to mix up the order. Okay, let's get these glued together. Okay, everybody's primed. Time for the glue. Now, when it comes to gluing, I don't do these as a batch. I do them joint by joint. You only have limited time where the PVC is going to be tacky from the adhesive, and you want to capitalize on that. It's about a 30-second window with a lot of products. So put it in, push, and twist. Then hold it down. And you really only need to hold it for a few seconds. I don't know, I count to 20. That's just my metric to make sure I do it each time and I don't short it. All right. There we go. It's not totally set. You can see it's a little gushy look in there, but it's not going anywhere. Time for side 2. Don't forget both surfaces every single time. Probably would work if you only did one. This way we know it's going to work. And push and twist. Then hold it down. All right, there we go. 1 joint, 3 more to go. There we go. We got 3 connections here. These will be going between our 4 main buckets, getting all of them connected to each other. The last connections will be going into bucket 1 and bucket 4 out to the reservoir. So those get different connections. While we let these cure, make sure that you've closed this up. These smell to high heaven. You'll have no confusion about that. Set it on the side, get yourself some fresh air. In the meantime, we're going to drill holes. All right, let's get this stuff out of the way. Okay, here's a bucket. How do you make sure that your hole is centered and as low as possible without causing a problem? Because buckets just aren't that cheap. There's a few different ways. You certainly could measure. So you know, find center here, find center up here, connect the two with a straight edge if you've got a speed square or a regular carpenter square. You draw a line there, and then make sure you take into account the total height of this nut. We're going to be using a wrench on the inside. It's actually designed for changing car oil filters to get around this and tighten it up, because we need to have everything connected and oriented and checked before we make the system tight, and there's not a lot of finger room in there. So as long as we can clear the edge of the nut, we are good to go, because that wrench is going to get around just fine for us and help us grab this remarkably large nut here. All right, my solution versus measuring was I measured once and then made a jig. And this literally just sits on the bottom, and then line up my hole saw and make the cut. The only other thing we have to consider is what bucket are we cutting into? So we have buckets 1, 2, 3, and 4. Bucket 1 and bucket 4 are going to be going out to the reservoir. So bucket 1 is going to have a hole here that will go out to our reservoir. Bucket 4 will have a hole here that will also go out to the reservoir. The rest of these, clearly not to scale, are going like this. So on bucket 1, opposite sides, we need to have a centered hole. Bucket 2, we need to have them on right angled sides from each other. 3 also, but in a different orientation. You can't just cut the same holes on those two buckets because they're mirrors of each other. And then 4, we're going to cut this one, but we're not going to cut this hole, just to be certain that we get the right position going through that port. It doesn't need to be in the middle, and honestly, this one doesn't either. But this one, because there's no porthole here that we're going through from the tent into the reservoir, we can cut it in the middle, and then we'll adjust using this piece of PVC here before we kind of hop through that hole. This one, that might be a little dependent. So we're going to take a look at that inside the tent before we cut its location. So when it comes to cutting, now that we've got this charted out, let's call this bucket 1. So we're going to go with opposite sides. Either measure and mark a center position, or make yourself a handy jig, and then drill straight through. Now, hole saws, if you've never used them before, can be a little grabby. Just take your time. A good hole saw is going to have a center bit here that's going to hold it true. You will find cheaper ones that don't include this. Just don't even buy them. It's not worth saving the money. I really like these Lennox hole saws because they last a really long time and they're great on pretty much all materials. But use what's available to you. Depending on the bulkheads that you pick out, you will need to scale that accordingly to your drill bit. All right, so let's cut some holes. All right, one hole down. You can see that grabbed a bit, but it is going to happen with hole saws. And then you end up with a chunk of plastic kind of stuck in here. What you need is a screwdriver or just something that you can push up in there and pop it out. So, with these little reliefs here, give it a push, out it comes, and you're ready for hole number 2. So there we go. Bucket number 1 has 1 centered hole, 2 centered holes. There is one last step we need to do, and that's deburring. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but we just need to make sure these edges are clean so that we get a good watertight seal. Here's the deburring tool I use, grabbed it off Amazon. And what this really is just, it's a little curved blade, and it pivots around. So you can run around the inside of the hole, both sides, and it'll get all these little straggly bits off. It is important to note that you're usually best off using very moderate pressure and one pass per surface. Otherwise, you will start gouging into your circle and making it bigger, and that may be a problem depending on how much leeway you have on your bulkhead in terms of how big that gasket is. Okay, look at that. Nice clean edges on those holes. Time to do the other 3 buckets. Okay, so this is going to be bucket number 2 here. That means we need a hole here and a hole here. So we're matching our diagram. Okay. Number 3 down here, very similar to number 2, but in different order. So we're going to be doing, let's see here, this side and this side, because I'm trying to keep my handles all oriented the same way. So here and here, let's make those holes. Okay, here we go. Bucket number 4. Clean off my notes here. This one, we're only cutting that hole. This last hole, we're actually going to cut after we align everything in the tent. So, there's our surface. Let's use our jig. All right, for our next step, we're going to need to change our bits because we are going to add in the connection that flows water into the system. So this is the initial business end of the hydroponic system. This is what's going to be feeding in the recirculating portion of the deep water recirculating system. And this actually comes pre-assembled from a company called PA Hydroponics. They make some really excellent stuff. They have some really great videos. Definitely check them out. But what we need to do here is take into account the distance we're going to be adding between our buckets and then figure out where we're going to drill these to make their smaller bulkheads fit. Here is one of the bulkheads from PA Hydroponics. These are very, very nice bulkheads. We have 2 gaskets, we have the main fitting, then we have the burr on the end and the nut. So the thing that is slightly tricky, depending on your bucket, is making sure, again, like the lower cutouts we made for our drains, these guys right here, we need to make sure everything can clear this. So as we look at our buckets here, we have to decide, this will be their orientation. So I can slide one of these in to give us an idea of rough spacing. And it is okay to be a little rough on the spacing here because this is flexible. One of the key things you do not want to do is cut this and make it uneven because the water flow comes up here and then out to your 4 buckets. So to make things shorter, because you can see on the camera here, it comes right at that curvature there, and I'm kind of not liking that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just let this bend down so the distance from the tee to the secondary tees that go out to the buckets is still even in terms of piping, but I can be 100% on the section of the bucket that is still flat. If I bring that bucket down here so you can see a little bit better, the nut just barely clears in there. And the nut is ever so slightly smaller because it's, or larger, excuse me, than its next piece because it has these little wings on it to help you turn. So we should be good as long as we stay in these areas. So let's get an appropriate drill bit and make this happen. All right, so this is the appropriate drill bit. In this case, it is a 1 1/4 inch bit. This is a Forstner bit, if it's one you're not familiar with. These are really, really nice because they've got a little, They've got a center spike there. They've got cutting faces here as well as the cutting faces for the edges. They make wonderfully clean holes, and this one, it just barely clears. They're both 1.25 inches. So if the opening is a little bit tight, I can go back, grab my deburring tool, widen it ever so slightly, because I'm going to be cleaning it up anyhow, and then seat this. When we go to seat them, we do need to remember that the burr section is going on the outside. This is what's interfacing with the holes. So the flat here is going to be on the interior. All right, last but not least, placement. We have to remember to be here and here. So instead of being worried about exact placement, what I'm going to do is with my Sharpie, I'm going to put a little X in the region where I need to have that hole made. And then as I line up the drill bit, I'm going to line it up as close to where it's still flat before I get into the curvature, because I don't want this gasket to be falling on any of that curvature, because then it's not going to actually seal. Now, we're not going to have water up to this point. In fact, we want there to be some airspace, because we get a waterfall effect that actually will add oxygen and gas to the water, because it's tumbling into the pool of water down here. We just want the spacing to be as regular as possible, and this has to stay as is. If you do shorten it, you have to shorten it by the exact same increment. Otherwise, you'll get uneven flow to different buckets. So just line it up nice and centered. And then as long as you can see, let me swing the drill around here, that the edge of the Forstner bit is clearly on the flat, then you're good to go. I take it and go just the tiniest bit over, just to be 100% certain that I'm good to go. Okay, first hole done. A little bit of cleanup. Clean edges mean better seals. And now while we're not going to be attaching the hose line, I do want to secure these into place. So in through the back, gasket down the front. And until we get into this lip, this is going to be a little tight on your fingers, so just adjust as you need to. You can push it back down a little bit, start tightening it up. You can even, sometimes it's easier to rotate this bit here and hold the nut in place until it's mostly tight. And then give it one last quarter turn. There you go. That looks pretty darn good. All right, we have 3 more buckets to go. Okay, so buckets 3 and 4, when you mark these, just make sure you pay attention to the fact that the other 2 are on that side. So in their correct orientation, just lay these down, mark the X's, then you're not going to forget. Okay, there we are. We are ready to, well, clean up first, and then we're going to head back and install these pipes and their bulkheads at the same time to settle the system. All right, that is our initial setup. We are ready to start connecting this system together, but inside the tent. That's going to be up on our next video. In the time being, please put your questions and comments down below. In the description, you're going to find links to each thing that I used in the video. Some of them are affiliate links, so if you choose to make a purchase, if you use one of my links, I'll get a small amount of income from that, and it goes a long, long way to helping me cover the cost of producing these videos and get more content out there for you. Now, don't forget about our sponsor. Growee is sponsoring this entire series, so if you hit their website, make sure that you check out all the great information they have there, but also remember to sign up for their newsletter. That newsletter is going to get you a 5% off coupon if you choose to purchase one of their systems. Also in the show notes, you're going to find a link to Muckles Incorporated. These folks have gone out of their way to help me make a set of clothes that if people enjoy what I'm doing, you too can own the hockey hoodie, the t-shirt, or the hat with that logo right on there. And that also goes a long way to just helping me produce these videos and make more content that you find useful. So we've got a few videos coming up. Make sure you subscribe and like down below and hit that little bell. That way you're going to get notifications when the next videos get posted and you can keep following this project right along. All right, thanks for your time. I hope that you're finding this content valuable, and keep going and make sure you plant it all.